Dear friends, welcome to this journey through the echoes of history, where faith, courage, and ambition collide under the blazing sun of the Crusades. Today, we step into the world of Tancred of Galilee, a knight of Norman blood, whose sword and spirit carved his name into the chronicles of the First Crusade. This is not just a tale of battle, but of dreams, honor, and the relentless pursuit of destiny. As you watch, you will walk through deserts and mountains, witness alliances forged and broken, and feel the weight of a crown that might have been. Tancred was more than a warrior. He was a man of vision, torn between duty and desire, loyalty and power. His story is the story of an age when faith guided armies, and kingdoms were born in the shadow of Jerusalem's walls. Together, we will explore the triumphs and tragedies that shaped his path, victories that shook empires, sacrifices that tested souls, and choices that still echo across centuries. So take your seat, open your heart, and prepare for a story where steel meets spirit, where the legacy of Tancred of Galilee still burns bright. Welcome, and let the journey begin. Imagine standing before the walls of Jerusalem, the heat of the desert burning your skin, your sword trembling in your hand. Not from fear, but from destiny. This was Tancred of Galilee, the knight who defied kings, who seized cities, and who dreamed of wearing a crown forged in both blood and faith. Subscribe for more history. Like and comment if you believe history should never be forgotten, and share to spark conversation about the lessons we must learn from the past. This is not myth. This is history, and it begins here. The story of Tancred of Galilee begins long before his own birth, in the windswept lands of Normandy. Here, in the rugged northern reaches of France, a fierce people were forged in steel and ambition. The Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled on Frankish soil, they carried within them the blood of conquerors, men who once raided the coasts but now built castles, ruled duchies, and dreamed of kingdoms far beyond their cold homeland. Among them rose the Hauteville family, whose daring spirit carried them across the seas into Italy and Sicily. From their strongholds, they carved out a new dominion, uniting Latin knights, Greek lords, and Arab emirs under one banner. It was a land of warriors and visionaries. And into this lineage was born Tancred, the son of Odo the good Marquis, nephew to Bohemond of Taranto. Even as a child, Tancred heard tales of his forefathers, Robert Guiscard, the indomitable duke who humbled empires, and Roger of Sicily, who crowned himself king of a realm torn from Saracen hands. Their names were etched in fire across Europe, and for young Tancred, they were not distant legends, but family. From his earliest days, he was trained in the arts of knighthood. In the courtyards of southern Italy, he learned to wield sword and spear, to ride war horses bred for battle, and to carry himself with the pride of Norman blood. Yet beyond skill, there was ambition, a hunger for glory that pulsed in his veins. The world was vast, and Tancred believed it held a place for him carved by destiny. But destiny is never without cost. The Norman princes were as much rivals as they were kin. Bohemond, Tancred's uncle, loomed as a giant of war and cunning, a figure both mentor and rival. Tancred admired him, but he also yearned to step out of his shadow, to make his own mark. It was in these formative years that the young knight began to dream, not only of land and titles, but of a cause greater than himself. Whispers from Rome spoke of a holy war, a crusade to free Jerusalem from the Saracens. Knights across Europe were stirring, their banners blessed by priests, their swords consecrated by faith. When the call finally reached Tancred, It was not just duty that moved him. It was the chance to write his name alongside his ancestors, to seize a destiny beyond Italy's shores. From Normandy's winds and Sicily's sun, a prince of war was rising. Thus began the tale of Tancred of Galilee, a story rooted in Norman fire, carried by the cross, and crowned with both glory and tragedy. In the quiet moments of his youth, Tancred often wandered beyond the walls of his family's stronghold. Though trained for war, his spirit was restless, stirred by visions greater than the boundaries of his homeland. He was not content to simply inherit titles or serve at the pleasure of his lords. In his heart burned the desire to shape the world, to become more than a name lost among the sons of Normandy. At dawn, he would climb the castle ramparts, staring across the rugged hills of southern Italy. To others, the fields and villages below were lands to govern, taxes to collect, but to Tancred, they were stepping stones, small pieces of a much larger mosaic. He dreamed of cities he had never seen: Jerusalem, Constantinople, Antioch, places whispered of by merchants and pilgrims. Cities radiant with mystery and promise. Stories reached him of knights who rode across continents, carving out realms of glory. He heard of Godfrey of Bouillon, a leader whose piety was matched by his sword, of Raymond of Toulouse, rich and cunning, and of his own uncle Bohemond, already a figure of legend. Tancred listened to these tales with wide eyes, his imagination shaping them into visions of his own destiny. Yet the boy's dreams were not only of conquest. At the monastery nearby, Tancred would kneel before the altar, staring at the flickering candles. He prayed for strength, not just to win battles, but to fight for a cause worthy of sacrifice. Though he bore the blood of warlords, he longed to be remembered as a knight of God, a defender of the faith. Still, his nature was far from gentle. In the practice yards, his blows were fierce, his laughter quick, his energy unrelenting. He fought older squires with reckless abandon, sometimes winning, sometimes falling hard onto the dust, but always rising again. He was fearless, almost to a fault, and his elders whispered that such boldness could lead to both greatness and ruin. As the years passed, Tancred's boyish wonder sharpened into resolve. No longer did he simply dream. He planned. He studied maps, listened to travelers, and sought every tale of the East. His mind was a forge, and in it, the fire of ambition tempered the steel of faith. Chaos. The time of waiting was drawing to an end. Soon Pope Urban's voice would echo across Christendom, calling warriors to march for the Holy Land. And when that call came, Tancred knew he would answer, not as a follower, but as a man ready to carve his own legend. For Tancred was no longer just a boy of dreams. For he was a knight in the making, and destiny waited beyond the horizon. In the year Ichenling Josewu, the world trembled with a voice that carried across kingdoms, the voice of Pope Urban II. At Clermont, before a sea of knights and peasants, he spoke of Jerusalem, the holy city, held by the Saracens. He spoke of pilgrims beaten and slain, of shrines desecrated, of the cross insulted. His words fell like thunder, igniting hearts with a holy fire. For Tancred, these words were more than a summons. They were a revelation. When the rumors reached southern Italy, he felt as if destiny itself had spoken. All his dreams of glory and faith, all his restless energy, found a single path: to take up the cross and march east. The church promised not only salvation but eternal honor for those who went. Men who had spent their lives warring over lands in France or Italy suddenly saw a higher purpose. Nobles sold their estates, peasants left their fields, monks blessed their swords. Bohemond II, restless after failed ventures in Italy, saw the Crusade as his chance to carve a kingdom from the east. He called upon his kin, and Tancred, still young yet fierce in spirit, was among the first to answer. Before the altar, he took the vow, receiving a small cloth cross sewn upon his garment. It was not merely fabric, it was a burden of destiny. Kneeling in the chapel's silence, Tancred whispered his pledge. He would ride not for silver nor for power alone, but for Christ and for Jerusalem. The boy of dreams had become the knight of a holy cause. The vow was only the beginning. To march east was no simple feat. The road was long, filled with dangers, and only the strongest in will and body would survive. In the courtyard of their stronghold, Tancred and Bohemond gathered their men. Norman knights clad in steel, Italian mercenaries hungry for plunder, peasants carrying little more than faith. All came forward. Before the priests they swore their oaths. Their swords were blessed, their banners consecrated. Tancred stood at the center, his young face fierce with determination. He knew the risks. Many would not return, yet he spoke with fire. Better to die beneath the walls of Jerusalem than to waste a life in idle comfort. Let our names be written in heaven. The men cheered, and their oaths bound them together. Brothers not by blood, but by the cross. When night fell, Tancred walked the halls alone. He touched the cold stone, wondering if he would ever return. But he did not fear. His heart was too full of purpose. Destiny had called, and he was ready. The road to the Holy Land began not in Jerusalem, but in the endless miles of Europe. In Seljuk, the armies of Christendom set out. Across fields, rivers, and mountain passes they marched, a tide of steel and faith flowing eastward. Tancred rode at the head of his men, the Norman banner fluttering above him. Behind him stretched a column of warriors, pilgrims, and beasts of burden. The journey was harsh. Supplies dwindled. Villages sometimes closed their gates, fearing the vast host. Yet Tancred's resolve never wavered. Through the Alps they climbed, their breath frosting in the cold air. In the plains of Hungary, they faced hostile locals, suspicious of foreign knights. At times hunger gnawed at their bellies, and men fell to illness. Still, the cry of Jerusalem carried them onward. At night, around the campfires, Tancred told tales of his ancestors, reminding his men of the glory of Normandy. He walked among them, not as a distant lord, but as a leader who shared their hunger and hardships. His charisma bound them to him, even more than the cross stitched upon their cloaks. The march through Europe was more than a passage of land. It was a forge, shaping Tancred's company into a brotherhood of steel and faith. And with each mile, Jerusalem drew nearer after months of hardship across Europe. The Crusaders reached the glittering edge of Christendom, Byzantium. To Tancred, it was like stepping into another world. The towering walls of Constantinople rose from the waters of the Bosporus, shining with golden domes and marble palaces. Merchants from every land crowded the streets, and the city seemed to breathe wealth and mystery. But beneath the grandeur lay suspicion. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, ruler of Byzantium, watched the approaching armies with wary eyes. To him, these Western knights were both a blessing and a threat. They came sworn to fight the Turks, yet their hunger for land and glory could just as easily turn upon him. Tancred entered the emperor's court alongside Bohemond. The hall blazed with silks, mosaics, and the scent of incense. Tancred, though young, stood tall and proud, refusing to be overshadowed. When Alexios demanded oaths of loyalty, the Crusader leaders hesitated. To swear fealty meant their conquests would belong to Byzantium, not themselves. Bohemond, with cunning, agreed. But Tancred hesitated. His blood burned at the thought of bending the knee to an emperor who had not shared their hardships. Yet politics demanded patience, and for the sake of the greater cause, he bit his pride. The passage through Byzantium was uneasy. The Crusaders marveled at the city's beauty, but grumbled at Byzantine arrogance. Still, Alexios provided guides and supplies, ensuring their passage across the Bosporus into Asia Minor. Tancred stood at the strait's edge, staring eastward. Beyond lay the true battlegrounds, the land of the Turks, the deserts, and the holy city itself. As the ships carried them across the waters, Tancred gripped his sword. Constantinople had dazzled him, but his heart longed for battle and glory. He swore silently that when his name was remembered, it would not be as a vassal of Byzantium, but as a prince of his own destiny. The journey into Asia had begun. The first true test awaited the Crusaders at Nicaea, a city held by the Seljuk Turks. Its high stone walls bristled with archers, and its lakeside position made it nearly unassailable. To take Nicaea would prove the Crusaders' resolve to both friend and foe. Tancred rode at the forefront, his banner snapping in the wind. The young Norman's eyes burned with the hunger for glory. Beside him, seasoned knights like Bohemond and Godfrey of Bouillon prepared their men. The siege was brutal. Arrows rained from the walls, striking shields and flesh alike. Siege towers groaned forward, covered in hides to resist fire. Tancred led assaults again and again, scaling ladders under showers of missiles. His shield was splintered, his mail dented, yet he pressed on with fierce determination. But the Turks were stubborn defenders. Their arrows cut down many, and boiling oil cascaded onto ladders. At times the Crusaders despaired, yet Tancred never wavered. His shouts and courage lifted spirits when hope seemed lost. In the end, Nicaea surrendered not to the sword, but to Byzantine cunning. Alexios' men negotiated secretly, raising the emperor's banner over the walls before the Crusaders could storm it. For Tancred, the moment was bitter. Victory had been theirs, but the prize belonged to Byzantium. He clenched his teeth, his pride wounded, but he swore the day would come when no emperor would steal his triumph. His triumph, soon after Nicaea, the Crusaders marched deeper into Asia Minor. But the Seljuks were not done. At Dorylaeum, their cavalry struck with lightning speed, surrounding the Crusaders in a deadly trap. At dawn, Tancred found himself in chaos. Arrows darkened the sky as the Turks circled, their horse archers striking from all sides. Panic spread among the unarmored pilgrims. Screams filled the air as the Seljuks cut down stragglers. But Tancred did not falter. Rallying his knights, he charged headlong at the enemy, his lance shattering against a Turk's shield. His sword flashed, carving a path through the swirling riders. Bohemond's booming voice carried across the field, urging men to hold. No, for hours the Crusaders endured, backs to wagons and shields raised. Dust choked the air, the heat unbearable. Yet, when all seemed lost, reinforcements under Godfrey and Raymond arrived. With renewed fury, the Crusaders counterattacked. Tancred rode at the spear's point, his sword crimson, his cry of Deus Vult piercing the din. The Turks broke, scattering into the hills. The field of Dorylaeum belonged to the cross. That day Tancred's courage shone. Not just a young knight, but a leader who could stand unbroken against terror. His legend was after Dorylaeum. The road to Antioch stretched across the burning plains of Anatolia. The Crusaders marched under a merciless sun, their armor searing to the touch. Water was scarce, food scarcer still. Horses collapsed in the dust, and men fell beside them, their lips cracked with thirst. For Tancred, this was a trial greater than any sword fight. He rode with his men, sharing their hardships, refusing extra rations even when offered. At night, he walked the campfires, speaking words of encouragement. His presence gave them strength when despair threatened to break them. Yet hunger gnawed even at his spirit. Some knights argued, tempers flaring in the heat. Pilgrims abandoned the march, vanishing into the wilderness. Still, Tancred pushed forward. He reminded them of Jerusalem, of Christ's tomb waiting to be freed. His fiery words kept the march alive. One night, as the stars burned cold above the desert, Tancred knelt in prayer. His body was weak, but his soul unshaken. He whispered, "Lord, if I must die in this land, let it be with my sword raised, not from hunger, on the road." The desert was cruel, but it could not break Tancred, Antioch, an ancient city vast and formidable, with walls so tall they seemed to scrape the sky. For the Crusaders, it was both promise and peril. Whoever held Antioch would command the road to Jerusalem. Yet to take it would mean months of siege, against an enemy well provisioned and cunning. When Tancred first gazed upon its mighty towers, his breath caught. Never had he seen such strength in stone. But his awe quickly hardened into resolve. If destiny demanded Antioch, then Antioch would fall. The siege began in late Ichenling Joshirti. Hunger soon returned, crueler than ever. The land around the city was stripped bare. The Crusaders gnawed roots and boiled leather. Still, Tancred endured. He led daring raids beyond the walls, striking at enemy patrols, seizing whatever food or supplies he could. His courage emboldened his men, though his body grew lean with hardship. Inside the city, the Seljuks jeered, raining arrows and insults from the walls. The defenders believed the Franks too weak to last. But Tancred's spirit refused to yield. At night, he stood before the campfires, vowing that no wall could withstand the will of God. When betrayal finally opened Antioch's gates to the Crusaders, it was a moment of triumph. Yet the battle was far from over. For beyond those walls, a vast Muslim army was already approaching, determined to reclaim the city. Antioch had fallen into Crusader hands. But survival was yet uncertain. The night of betrayal changed everything. Bohemond had conspired with a guard within Antioch, and under cover of darkness, a gate was opened. The Crusaders surged forward, desperate and furious, their hunger fueling their rage. Tancred was among the first through the breach. His sword gleamed in torchlight as he fought street by street, his battle cry echoing off stone. The defenders resisted fiercely. But the element of surprise had broken their strength. Blood flowed in the alleys as the Normans carved their way toward the citadel. By dawn, Antioch was theirs. The Crusaders staggered through its streets, triumphant but hollow-eyed from starvation. Tancred stood upon the walls, gazing down at the city, now claimed in Christ's name. For a moment, pride filled his heart. He had fought not as a boy, but as a prince of war. Yet joy was short-lived. Even as the Franks secured the city, news spread like wildfire. An enormous Muslim army under Kurbagar of Mosul was marching to retake Antioch. Tens of thousands strong, it would fall upon them within days. Tancred's victory tasted of ashes. He had conquered Antioch, but now he must defend it against a tide that could drown them all. The test of his courage had only just begun. The Crusaders held Antioch, but they were starving and surrounded. Kurbagar's vast army encircled the city, cutting off all hope of supply. Men weakened, some deserted, others whispered that God had abandoned them. Despair hung heavy in the air. Then came a vision. A humble Provençal priest, Peter Bartholomew, claimed he had received a divine revelation. The Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion, lay buried beneath a church in Antioch. Tancred, weary yet desperate for hope, joined the others as the earth was dug. For hours they clawed at the ground, doubt gnawing at their hearts. And then steel struck steel. A lance head was pulled from the dirt. The Crusaders gasped, some falling to their knees in tears. Tancred touched the relic with reverence. Whether miracle or trick, it mattered little. The Holy Lance gave the people faith again. The weary became warriors. The hopeless became lions. When the Crusaders sallied forth against Kerboga, Tancred rode with the Holy Lance borne before them. Against all odds, the vast Turkish army broke and fled. Antioch was saved, not by strength of arms alone, but by faith reborn. Victory brought glory, but also envy. Within the Crusader host, rivalries deepened. Princes and lords quarreled over lands, spoils, and honor. Tancred, though still young, found himself locked in disputes. His ambition was no secret. He wanted more than to serve beneath others. He longed to rule. Yet his uncle Bohemond, ever cunning, seized Antioch for himself, refusing to yield it to Byzantium. Tancred admired his boldness, but bristled at his shadow. Clashes came with Baldwin of Bologna, who sought power in Edessa, and with Raymond of Toulouse, whose pride matched his wealth. Tancred fought not only on the battlefield but in the court of politics, where every word was a weapon. Yet his spirit was too fierce to bow quietly. When challenged, he reminded his rivals of his valor at Dorylaeum, Antioch, and every desperate march. His name was whispered with respect, and sometimes with fear, but rivalry also sharpened him. No longer just a knight, Tancred was becoming a leader among leaders. Still, in the shadows of Bohemond and Baldwin, he wondered, would his chance for a crown ever come? At last, the Crusaders turned their eyes to the true prize, Jerusalem, in lineage. The host marched south through Syria and into Palestine, their banners flying high, despite their hunger and exhaustion. For Tancred, the journey felt like destiny fulfilled. Every mile brought him closer to the tomb of Christ, closer to the holy city that had inspired his youth. He rode at the vanguard, sword on his hip, cloak whipping in the desert winds. The march was no triumphal procession. Heat, thirst, and skirmishes with local forces tested them at every step, yet their faith carried them. Pilgrims sang hymns as they trudged, voices thin but unwavering. Tancred himself dismounted often, walking among them, lifting children to ride his horse, encouraging the weary. When at last Jerusalem's walls appeared on the horizon, a cry swept through the host. Men wept openly, knights fell to their knees, priests lifted crosses high. Tancred stood still, staring in awe. He had dreamed of this moment since boyhood. And now the holy city stood before him, but awe soon hardened into resolve. To take Jerusalem would require fire, blood, and steel. And Tancred was ready. The final test had come. Jerusalem, the city of David and of Christ, loomed before them. Its massive walls gleamed in the sun, defended by Fatimid soldiers ready to repel the invaders. The Crusaders built siege towers and catapults from the sparse wood of the hills. Every plank was precious, every nail hammered with prayer. Tancred took command of one assault, his men constructing a towering engine of war. When the attack began, chaos engulfed the city. Arrows rained, stones thundered down, flames licked the sky. Tancred led his men up the siege tower, his shield raised against a storm of missiles. With each step, he shouted encouragement, urging his soldiers upward. At last, the tower met the wall. Tancred leapt onto the battlements, sword flashing, his cry echoing, "For Christ and for Jerusalem." His men surged after him, overwhelming the defenders. By July the Crusaders had breached the city. The streets ran red, the holy places claimed by sword. Tancred himself raised his banner over part of the city, declaring protection for those who sought refuge. His moment had come, not only as a warrior, but as a prince of Jerusalem. The holy city had fallen. Jerusalem belonged to the Crusaders. Pilgrims knelt at the sepulchre. Knights wept upon the stones. Priests sang hymns in triumph. Yet amid the rejoicing, Tancred stood apart. For though the city was theirs, he felt the burden of responsibility heavier than the sword at his side. Pari. In the chaos of conquest, Tancred had claimed part of the city as his own. He hung his banner from the towers and promised safety to those who sought his protection. Unlike some lords who shed blood without mercy, Tancred tempered his ferocity with honor. He shielded Christians, and even some Muslims who fled beneath his banner. In him burned not only ambition, but the knightly code he cherished. Still, his eyes lingered on the Holy Sepulchre, on the Temple Mount, on the streets where Christ had once walked. He had fought his way to the holiest of places, but he knew this was not the end of his journey. For every victory opened the door to new rivalries, new ambitions. Tancred was no longer just a knight of the cross. In Jerusalem, he became a guardian of Christendom's greatest prize. From Jerusalem, Tancred's destiny expanded. In the reshaping of the Holy Land, new principalities were carved, and Tancred was granted lordship over Galilee, a fertile land of hills, lakes, and ancient towns. Here, he was no longer just a warrior. He was a ruler. He built fortresses, organized garrisons, and established laws. His men patrolled the countryside, ensuring safe passage for pilgrims. Farmers returned to their fields, shepherds to their flocks. Tancred was both sword and shield, defender and prince. Yet his rule was not without conflict. Muslim raiders tested his borders, and rival Crusader lords eyed Galilee with envy. Still, Tancred's presence inspired loyalty. His soldiers admired his courage. His people respected his justice. In time, Tancred of Galilee became a name whispered with reverence throughout the Holy Land. But within him, ambition stirred. Galilee was rich but small. He dreamed of more, of Antioch, of crowns, of a realm as mighty as that of his forefathers in Sicily. Prince though he was, he yearned for kingly glory. The Crusader states were fragile, newborn realms torn by ambition. Baldwin had taken the throne of Jerusalem. Raymond held Tripoli, Bohemond Antioch. Rivalries flared into open conflict. Tancred, though young, was no bystander. When disputes arose over borders and castles, his sword and banner were soon in the field. His men clashed with other Crusader factions, as often as with Muslim foes. To rule the Holy Land was to walk on a blade's edge. In these wars of succession, Tancred proved both warrior and diplomat. He fought with valor, but also negotiated truces when blood threatened to drown them all. Yet his ambition often placed him at odds with Baldwin and Raymond. To them, Tancred was too proud, too hungry for glory. To Tancred, they were obstacles to his rightful place. Still, his actions marked him as one of the strongest princes of Outremer. Even in conflict, his reputation grew. The Knight of Galilee had become a contender for far greater power. Though rivalries consumed the Crusaders, the true test came from without. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, furious at the loss of Jerusalem, sent armies north to reclaim the holy city. Tancred rode to meet them, his banner flying proudly. In battle after battle, he fought not for ambition alone, but to defend Christendom's heart. At Ascalon, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Baldwin, his sword red with the blood of Fatimid soldiers. The clash was brutal, shields shattered, men trampled, the desert trembling beneath the charge. Tancred fought like a lion, striking down foes, rallying his men when hope faltered. His courage turned the tide, and the enemy was routed. For this, Tancred earned the love of the pilgrims and the respect of his peers. No longer just a rival prince, he was hailed as one of the defenders of the cross, a shield of Jerusalem. Yet even in victory, his ambition whispered, was defense enough? Or was he meant to wear a crown? By now, Tancred was no longer merely a knight of fortune. He was a prince, a commander, a man whose name carried weight across the Holy Land. Yet still, he dreamed of more. At night, in his hall at Galilee, he studied maps by lamplight. He imagined Antioch under his rule, Jerusalem beneath his crown, even perhaps a kingdom stretching across Syria. His blood was Norman. His ancestors had carved realms from nothing. Why should he not do the same? But ambition was both flame and shadow. Baldwin watched him with suspicion. Other lords whispered that Tancred's hunger would tear the fragile Crusader states apart. And Tancred himself, though proud, wrestled with doubt. Was he meant to be a servant of God's will, or the master of his own destiny? The dream of a crown haunted him. He had proven himself in battle, in rule, in faith. Yet the crown always seemed just out of reach, shining before him like a star he could never grasp. Still, Tancred vowed that he would not rest until he had claimed his place, not as a mere prince, but as a king. Though Jerusalem had been won, peace was fleeting. King Baldwin I of Jerusalem ruled with a steady hand, but Tancred's ambition and independence often clashed with the king's authority. Baldwin expected loyalty, while Tancred demanded recognition as more than just a vassal. Their rivalry simmered at councils. Baldwin spoke with regal command, while Tancred, fiery and impatient, countered with bold words. Many knights watched nervously, knowing that disunity among princes could shatter the fragile kingdom. At times their quarrels boiled into near-open conflict. Baldwin accused Tancred of pride. Tancred accused Baldwin of jealousy. Yet despite their rivalry, both men shared the same battlefield when enemies threatened. For the sake of Jerusalem, they fought side by side, their swords uniting even as their wills clashed. For Tancred, Baldwin was not only a rival, but a reminder of what he himself lacked: the crown. Every time he knelt before Baldwin, it burned like a wound. Still, he endured for the sake of the cross, but always with an eye on the day when he might rise above. In Ichen Ebite, the port city of Haifa became a prize, contested by both Crusaders and its defenders. Baldwin sought to secure it for Jerusalem, while Tancred saw it as an opportunity to expand his influence. Tancred led the assault with characteristic ferocity. Siege engines battered the walls, while ships from Genoa attacked from the sea. The defenders resisted with courage, hurling stones and burning oil. Tancred fought at the front, scaling ladders beneath a storm of arrows. His shield was blackened by fire, his sword ringing against enemy steel. His men, inspired, surged after him. The Genoese breached the harbor, and together they forced Haifa into submission. Yet when victory came, Tancred's pride was wounded. Baldwin claimed the city for Jerusalem, offering Tancred little reward. Though outwardly obedient, Tancred seethed. Each conquest that slipped from his grasp deepened his hunger for a crown of his own. Though known as a warrior, Tancred proved equally skilled in rule. In Galilee and beyond, he established laws, secured roads, and dealt with both allies and foes. Through diplomacy, he forged alliances with local lords, sometimes by the sword, sometimes by oath. He negotiated truces with Muslim emirs, demanding tribute and safe passage for pilgrims. His justice was stern but respected, and his name became feared and admired alike. Tancred was no longer just a knight of dreams. He was becoming a statesman. His decisions carried weight. His diplomacy shaped the fragile states of Outremer. Yet with each treaty signed, each oath taken, his desire for sovereignty only deepened. Why should he serve under Baldwin or Bohemond when he had proven himself capable of ruling in his own right? Or, in this balance between sword and pen, Tancred grew into the prince history would remember. Despite his ambition, Tancred's faith never faltered. He was not merely a prince of steel, but of the cross. In Galilee, he built and restored churches, ensuring priests had protection. He joined processions barefoot, humbling himself before God. When Muslim forces raided, Tancred often rode with relics borne before his army, believing divine power would shield them. His devotion inspired his men, who saw in him both warrior and holy knight. Yet faith also tested him. He wrestled with guilt over ambition, wondering if his hunger for crowns contradicted God's will. At times, he knelt in solitude, whispering prayers for guidance. He longed to be not just remembered as a conqueror, but sanctified as a servant of Christ. For Tancred, sword and faith were inseparable. One defended the body, the other the soul. Together, they forged his legend. With power came weight. Tancred ruled lands, commanded armies, and inspired loyalty, but every victory demanded sacrifice. His men died by the thousands in battles and marches. His treasury emptied with fortresses to maintain and armies to feed. At night, Tancred often walked the ramparts of his stronghold, gazing across Galilee's hills. He bore not only his own dreams, but the lives of countless men and families who depended on him. Each decision could mean survival or ruin. Rival lords whispered against him, Baldwin eyed him with suspicion, and enemies pressed at his borders. The burden was heavy, yet Tancred carried it with unyielding pride. He was born to lead, and though the crown eluded him, he would not falter. But in the stillness of night, when only the wind moved, even Tancred felt the weight of his choices pressing upon his soul. Glory had its cost, and the Prince of Galilee paid it dearly. In Echen Ebite, news struck like a thunderclap. Bohemond of Taranto, Tancred's mighty uncle and lord of Antioch, had been captured in battle by the Danish men Turks. Antioch, jewel of the Crusader states, stood vulnerable, its throne suddenly empty. All eyes turned to Tancred. Though young, he was the natural heir to Bohemond's authority. The knights of Antioch swore allegiance to him, trusting his courage and bloodline. Thus, Tancred became regent of one of the most powerful cities in the East. He ruled not only with the sword but with determination. He fortified Antioch's walls, rallied its garrisons, and extended Norman authority across the surrounding lands. His enemies, once emboldened by Bohemond's fall, soon realized that Tancred was no less a man. He defended Antioch with vigor, proving himself equal to the task. Yet ruling Antioch was no small burden. Rivals within and without challenged him, and Baldwin in Jerusalem eyed him warily. Tancred had stepped out of his uncle's shadow, but with new power came new enemies. Still, as he sat upon Antioch's throne, Tancred felt closer than ever to the dream that haunted him, a crown of his own. As regent, Tancred's first trial was Antioch's defense. Muslim forces gathered at its borders, believing the city ripe for conquest. After Bohemond's capture, but Tancred was no passive guardian. He rode forth with his knights, striking enemy raiders with swift and brutal force. From the citadel towers, he oversaw the strengthening of walls, the training of soldiers, and the gathering of supplies. His leadership turned Antioch into a fortress of steel and stone. The people, fearful of invasion, grew to trust him, for he defended not only the walls but the spirit of the city. He forged alliances with Armenians and local Christians, promising them protection in return for loyalty. Slowly, Antioch's fractured society knit itself together under his hand, but every victory only increased his ambition. Antioch was his now, if only by regency. Why should he yield it when Bohemond returned? The thought burned in his heart. Though Tancred ruled Antioch, his ambition for a crown was constantly frustrated. Baldwin of Jerusalem refused to recognize him as king, insisting Antioch remained tied to Byzantium by oath. Even Bohemond, once released, reclaimed authority, pressing Tancred back into second place. For Tancred, this was agony. He had proven himself as regent, defended Antioch, and ruled as a prince should. Yet when the time came, he was still denied the crown he craved. His uncle's shadow stretched long, and Baldwin's suspicion barred him from Jerusalem's throne. Tancred bore it with pride, but inwardly he raged. At councils, his jaw tightened when Bohemond spoke. His fists clenched when Baldwin dismissed him. He was a lion chained, forced to bow while knowing he had the strength to rule. His crown was always within sight, but always beyond reach. Frustrated by crowns denied him, Tancred turned outward. He sought alliances beyond the Crusader lords, especially with the Armenian princes of Cilicia. These local rulers, long oppressed by Turks, welcomed Tancred's protection. He negotiated marriages, treaties, and military pacts. Armenians joined his armies, their banners flying alongside his own. Together they fortified castles, ensuring that Antioch's borders were guarded. These bonds gave Tancred both strength and prestige. The Armenians respected his courage, and many began to see him as more than just a Norman prince. They saw him as a leader who might one day unite their lands with his. Yet Baldwin and Bohemond viewed these alliances with suspicion. Tancred's growing influence threatened their balance of power. For Tancred, it was further proof. The crown was denied him not for lack of worth, but because others feared his greatness. In each battling sea, Tancred faced his greatest test and his greatest defeat at the Battle of Artah. The Crusaders, seeking to expand their power, marched against Muslim forces. In Mesopotamia, Tancred, bold as ever, rode at the forefront, his men eager for glory. At first, victory seemed near. The Crusaders captured Haran's outskirts, their banners raised high. But it was a trap. The enemy lured them out, then struck with overwhelming force. Chaos erupted. The Crusader lines shattered under the sudden onslaught. Knights fell, banners toppled, and screams filled the air. Tancred fought like a lion, cutting down foes on every side, refusing to retreat. His sword flashed crimson, his warhorse reared, his cries of Deus Vult thundered above the din. But courage could not turn the tide. The Crusaders were routed, their forces annihilated. Many lords were captured, their dreams shattered in a single day. Tancred escaped with his life, but the loss haunted him. For the first time, his fire had failed to win the day. Haran was a wound that never healed, a bitter reminder that even the bravest knight could not escape fate. After the disaster at Haran, Tancred returned to Galilee with a heavier heart. Once the fiery young knight who dreamed of crowns, he was now a man scarred by defeat. Yet he did not abandon his duty. Galilee remained his domain, and he returned determined to protect it, with all that remained of his strength. The people welcomed him as their prince. Farmers bowed, pilgrims praised his name. Knights swore again their loyalty. Though humbled, Tancred still inspired devotion. His presence was a shield against raiders, and a promise that Galilee would not fall. He rebuilt fortresses, patrolled roads, and restored order. After years of turmoil, in him, the people found both protector and ruler, though his ambition for greater thrones still smoldered quietly. At night, he would look toward Antioch and Jerusalem, wondering what might have been, but by day, he worked tirelessly for his people. Tancred had not become a king, but he was still a prince beloved. His name endured, not in crowns, but in the hearts of those who lived under his protection. Jerusalem drew pilgrims from every corner of Christendom, and their path often ran through Tancred's lands. Bandits, raiders, and rival forces threatened them, but Tancred made their safety his mission. He ordered patrols along the roads, built watchtowers, and stationed knights at key crossings. When raiders struck, Tancred was swift in vengeance, ensuring no crime went unpunished. To pilgrims, his name became a prayer of safety. May Tancred guard our road, Tancred often rode out himself, escorting groups of weary travelers. He spoke kindly to the poor, offering food and water, lifting children onto his horse. To him their journey was not just a passage, but a holy duty. He was bound to protect, though still driven by ambition. In these moments, Tancred showed his truest nobility. He was more than a warrior. He was a shepherd of souls, guiding them through peril to the holy city, though age and hardship weighed on him. Tancred's sword was not yet stilled. In his final campaigns, he led raids and battles against Muslim forces that threatened Galilee and Antioch. His vigor inspired his men, even as his body began to weaken. At one skirmish near Apamea, Tancred rode at the head of his cavalry, his cry echoing like in days of old. He struck down foes with the same fire that had carried him at Dorlium and Jerusalem. His men followed with unshaken loyalty, for they knew their prince would never falter. These victories, though smaller than the great battles of his youth, restored his pride. They were proof that even in his later years, Tancred remained a force to be reckoned with. His banner still commanded fear. His name still carried weight across the east. But as the cheers of victory faded, Tancred felt the shadow of time pressing closer. He knew his battles were numbered. Victory could not shield Tancred from his final enemy. Illness crept upon him like a silent foe. At first it was fatigue, then fever, then weakness, that no armor could protect against. His knights watched with sorrow as their once tireless prince struggled to rise from his bed. Tancred fought even illness with defiance, insisting on donning armor, walking the halls, and giving orders. But each day his strength waned. At night, he prayed long hours, whispering confessions, begging God to judge him not only by his ambition, but by his faith. He thought of Jerusalem, of Antioch, of crowns denied, and victories won. He thought of his youth, when dreams burned brighter than the sun, and of the man he had become, scarred, weary, but still unbroken. True. The illness tightened its grip, and Tancred knew the end was near. Yet even then he swore he would not die as a defeated man, but as a knight of the cross. At last, the day came. Tancred, Prince of Galilee, lay surrounded by his knights and priests. The air was heavy with sorrow, yet calm, as though all knew the end of a great story had arrived. Summoning his fading strength, Tancred raised his voice one final time. "I have fought for the cross," he whispered. "I have bled for Jerusalem. I have dreamed of crowns, but I surrender now to the King above all kings." He bade farewell to his knights, thanking them for their loyalty. To the priests he confessed his sins, seeking absolution. To God he offered his last prayer, that his name would be remembered not only for the battles he fought, but for the faith he kept. Then, as the candles flickered low, Tancred's hand fell still upon his sword. The Prince of Galilee breathed his last, his eyes closing with the peace of a warrior who had given all. The knights wept, their grief heavy, for with him passed not only a leader, but a legend. In silence, they draped his body in his banner, placing his sword upon his chest. Thus ended the life of Tancred, a knight of dreams and destiny. When word spread that Tancred was dead, Galilee fell into mourning. Knights, peasants, and pilgrims alike wept, for they had lost not just a prince, but a protector. Bells tolled from churches, and priests led processions through the towns. His knights carried his body draped in his banner, sword upon his chest, to be laid to rest with honor. Crowds lined the roads, kneeling in silence as the funeral passed. Some whispered prayers, others cried aloud, and many touched the banner as it passed, as if seeking strength from their fallen lord. Even his rivals paused in respect. Baldwin, though wary of Tancred in life, acknowledged his courage. chroniclers began to write of his deeds, of battles fought and lives saved. His name echoed not in the courts of kings, but in the hearts of those who had marched with him, prayed with him, and lived beneath his shield. Galilee mourned not merely a warrior, but a man who had borne the burdens of rule, faith, and destiny. And though Tancred was gone, his memory lived in every stone of the fortresses he built, every pilgrim road he had guarded, and every heart he had touched. Tancred's story might have ended with his death, but the pen of the chroniclers ensured his name endured. Writers across Christendom set down his deeds, the daring charges, the fiery speeches, the restless ambition. Some praised him as a true knight of the cross, a man of courage and honor, who defended the Holy Land with tireless faith. Others whispered of his pride, his quarrels with Baldwin, his hunger for crowns that were never his. Yet all agreed, Tancred's life had burned brightly, leaving a mark no time could erase. In the monasteries of Europe, pilgrims carried tales of him, speaking of the Norman prince who fought lions of men and prayed with monks in humble chapels. Songs were sung, legends grew, and his name joined those of Godfrey, Raymond, and Bohemond as one of the great princes of the First Crusade. Though he died without a crown, Tancred had won something greater: immortality in the pages of history. Despite his fame, Tancred never wore the crown he dreamed of. In Antioch, Bohemond reclaimed power. In Jerusalem, Baldwin ruled as king. For all his victories and loyalty, Tancred was always overshadowed. The chroniclers often asked, what if? What if Tancred had seized Antioch outright? What if he had taken Jerusalem for himself? Might the Crusader states have been stronger under his rule? Might the Norman flame have burned even brighter in the east? Tancred's legacy was thus tinged with melancholy. He had all the qualities of a king: bravery, leadership, faith. But fate denied him the title. The lost crown became part of his legend, making his story not only one of triumph, but of tragedy. Yet perhaps this was fitting, for Tancred was more than a ruler of lands. He was a symbol of the Crusades themselves, glorious, flawed, filled with faith, ambition, and sacrifice. His lost crown was not a failure, but a reminder that destiny shapes men in ways beyond their desires. Though his body lay in Galilee, Tancred's spirit lingered. Pilgrims spoke of him as protector of the roads. Knights invoked his name before battle, and priests remembered him in prayers. In stories, he became larger than life, a warrior who could not be conquered, even by death. Some said they felt his presence on the winds of Galilee, watching over travelers. Others claimed his ghost walked the ramparts of Antioch, still guarding the city he once ruled. His legend merged with myth, his deeds told not only as history, but as lessons in courage and faith. For the people of the Holy Land, Tancred was more than a man. He was a spirit of defiance and protection. His legacy was not merely written but lived. In every pilgrim who dared the road, in every knight who lifted his sword in faith. Tancred had sought a crown of gold, but he was given something greater, a crown of memory, worn forever in the hearts of those he had inspired. Centuries have passed since Tancred rode through deserts and scaled walls. Yet his story endures. He was not the greatest king, for he wore no crown. He was not the richest, for his coffers were often empty. Yet he was something more enduring, a knight who embodied the fire of the Crusades. His courage at Dorylaeum, his valor at Jerusalem, his rule in Galilee, these became part of the eternal memory of Christendom. Chroniclers in. Though denied a throne, he won a legacy that outlived kings. His name became an eternal flame, passed from lips to parchment, from stories to songs. In every tale of the First Crusade, Tancred of Galilee burns bright. Thus ends his story, not in sorrow, but in immortality. For though the man has passed, the flame of his spirit will never die.